envy is something much more like a networked handheld device. It's small, but it's very powerful, and it's networked together. I think what the internet did for PCs, and this is what we're trying to do for cars, is to connect the vehicles together. Because we can't solve many of the emerging challenges associated with the mobility unless we solve making these vehicles communicate with each other so they can act in a coordinated fashion. It's not enough just to make a vehicle clean and safe. If it's still going to get stuck in traffic or has difficulty finding parking, you're not going to buy a vehicle. It doesn't matter how clean or safe it is if you live in a big city. So the reason this is becoming more and more important is that more and more people are living in big cities around the world. 2007 was the very first year in history that a majority of the world's population began to live in urban areas. This trend started in the 1800s in England, in the 1900s in America, and now it's happening in this century in China and India. More and more people are moving from rural parts of the country to the urban areas in search of a better life, with the shift from agriculture to industrial societies. So this trend is going to increase in the future. We think that by the year 2030, about 60% of the world's population will be living in urban areas, and about 80% of the wealth will be concentrated in urban areas. I mean, if you think about it, people in urban areas tend to be wealthier on average than people in rural areas. That's why people move from rural to urban areas. So anything that is affected by wealth, whether it's the consumption of materials, the consumption of energy, emissions of greenhouse gases, is increasingly going to be driven by people who live in urban areas. So we can't solve, or we can't hope to solve global challenges associated with energy and environment unless we solve urban challenges. And that's why we think that this solution is going to be increasingly needed. Our business is going to be increasingly in the emerging markets. We're selling the majority of our vehicles there, and the fraction of our vehicles that we sell is going to increase in those markets. But in those markets, like in China and India, where the wealth is increasing, they live in very densely populated cities, much more densely populated even than Manhattan. And we all know that in Manhattan, you're far less likely to own a vehicle than if you live in the rest of America as a whole, because when it's a densely populated city, you have alternatives like public transport, and you have difficulty driving a car because of parking issues and traffic. So if we don't solve this problem, then vehicles aren't going to be as needed in the future. So it's up to us to come up with an alternative that preserves or even enhances personal mobility, because we think it's important that people have personal mobility. Trains and buses have limitations, walking and cycling have limitations. The car, as designed for urban use, has limitations that we have to recognize and try to address those shortcomings while still preserving personal mobility. And we think we have a solution with Envy. So basically, we don't think it's sufficient to address these issues. It's necessary. We must continue to make vehicles more efficient and cleaner and safer, but if you live in a big city, that's not going to be enough. We also have to solve the issues associated with congestion and parking, because the value proposition associated with mobility isn't going to be solved just by making the vehicle cleaner or safer. So at GM, for the last 10 years or so, we've been talking about a new DNA being needed for the car or the automobile. If you think about today's automobiles that you see, that you probably use today as a rental car or whatever, it's very similar in many respects to the car of 100 years ago. It's fueled with petroleum-based fuels like gasoline or diesel. It has an internal combustion engine. It has brakes and steering systems that are largely mechanically driven. And very importantly, it's unconnected. It's a standalone device that doesn't communicate with other vehicles or with the infrastructure. So vehicles at a profound level have not changed for the last 100 years. What we're saying is that in the future we think that vehicles will increasingly have to be electrically driven, and they will have to be connected, and they also need to be tailored to their application. The three designs of the vehicles that you saw in the video before Dan introduced me, they all share the same platform. They all have the same capabilities. They look different, but they all perform the same way. They're all battery electric vehicles. They're all autonomous vehicles, but they look different because of the coaches. But they all share the same technology platform.